September 8th, 1941. A German artillery shell screams over the Neva River and slams into a warehouse on the southern edge of Leningrad. Within minutes, the WWII food warehouses are engulfed in flames. 2,500 tons of flour, 700 tons of meat and lard, thousands of tons of sugar melting into the ground, forming rivers of sweetness that pooled in the streets. For the next 2.5 years, residents would return to this spot, scraping up handfuls of dirt mixed with burnt sugar just to survive another day. That fire marked the beginning of what would become the longest and most destructive siege in modern history. 872 days, over 1 million dead, an entire city slowly starving while the world watched. And the thing is, it didn't have to happen this way. Hitler had a choice to make about Leningrad, and the decision he made condemned the city to unimaginable horror. This is the story of how 1 million people were trapped in a frozen city, and what they did to survive. Before we dive into this story, if you're into detailed military history that doesn't hold back on the brutal realities of war, go ahead and subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, events that shaped our world in ways most people never learn about. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's get into what happened in Leningrad. To understand the siege, you need to understand what Leningrad meant. This wasn't just another Soviet city. Founded by Peter the Great in 1703, it had been Russia's imperial capital for over 2 centuries. When the Bolsheviks took power in 1917, it happened here. The revolution started in Leningrad, then called Petrograd. Lenin's body was here. The city bore his name. For the Soviets, Leningrad was the symbolic heart of communism. For Hitler, it was a target that carried enormous ideological weight. By mid-1941, Operation Barbarossa was rolling east. 3 million German and Axis troops had crashed into the Soviet Union on June 22nd. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, had one primary objective: capture Leningrad. The city had a population of roughly 3 million people. It was the Soviet Union's second-largest city, a major industrial center producing tanks, artillery, and warships. The Baltic Fleet was anchored there. Taking Leningrad would knock out Soviet naval power in the north, free up troops for the drive on Moscow, and deliver a crushing psychological blow. The German advance was brutally efficient. By early September, Army Group North had covered nearly 500 miles in less than 3 months. They cut the last railway line into Leningrad on August 30th. On September 8th, German forces reached the shores of Lake Ladoga to the east, completing the encirclement. Leningrad was cut off. No roads in, no railways, just Lake Ladoga to the east, which would freeze solid in a matter of weeks, and the German and Finnish armies tightening the noose from every other direction. Here's where Hitler made his decision. His generals wanted to storm the city. Standard military doctrine: take the objective, capture the industry, eliminate the resistance. But Hitler had other plans. On September 21st, he issued a directive. Leningrad was not to be captured. It was to be besieged, bombarded, and starved into submission. Hitler's reasoning was cold and calculated. Why lose German soldiers taking a city when you could simply let the population die? Once everyone inside was dead, the city could be razed to the ground and the land handed over to Finland. The entire population of Leningrad, 3 million civilians, had just been sentenced to death by starvation. The siege closed like a steel trap. German artillery positions surrounded the city in a semicircle from the south and west. Finnish forces, allied with Germany, held positions to the north. Only Lake Ladoga offered any potential lifeline, but it was 40 miles across, exposed to German aircraft, and would soon be frozen. Inside the city, Soviet authorities were desperately unprepared. Food stockpiles were catastrophically inadequate. According to records from the Leningrad front, on September 12th, just 4 days into the siege, the city had enough flour for 35 days, cereals for 30 days, meat for 33 days, and fats for 45 days. That was it. And those estimates assumed the warehouses wouldn't be bombed. The Badaev warehouse fire on September 8th made everything worse. The official Soviet investigation later revealed the full extent of the loss. Beyond the immediate destruction of food stores, the fire created a psychological crisis. Rumors spread that the entire city's food supply had burned. Panic buying stripped store shelves bare within days. The Soviet command tried to maintain order, but the reality was unavoidable. Leningrad had roughly 2 months before mass starvation began. German artillery started hammering the city on September 4th, 4 days before the encirclement was complete. The bombardment was systematic. Shells rained down on residential neighborhoods, hospitals, factories, and cultural landmarks. The Germans fired over 150,000 artillery shells into Leningrad during the siege. Thousands more bombs were dropped by the Luftwaffe. The goal wasn't military, it was terror. Make life inside the city so unbearable that surrender became the only option. But surrender wasn't an option the Soviets were willing to consider. Stalin's order was explicit: Leningrad would not fall. Defeatism was punishable by execution. The city's commander, Marshal Kliment Voroshilov, was replaced in early September by General Georgy Zhukov, who immediately implemented brutal discipline. Desertion meant death. Retreat without orders meant death. The Red Army would hold the line or die trying. And behind them, the civilians had nowhere to go. By late September, the first ration cuts began. Bread rations were reduced to 600 grams per day for workers, 400 grams for office employees, and 300 grams for dependents and children. For context, 600 grams is about 1.5 pounds of bread. Not great, but survivable if you had other food sources. But there were no other food sources. The ration was the only food most people would see. And it was about to get much, much worse. November 1941 was when the dying truly began. The bread ration was cut again. By November 20th, workers received only 250 grams of bread per day. Office employees and dependents got 125 grams. That's a quarter pound of bread for the entire day. And it wasn't real bread. The city's bakers were mixing anything they could find into the dough: sawdust, cellulose, cottonseed cake, wallpaper paste. Survivors later described the bread as black, dense, and tasting like earth, but it was calories, and calories meant life. The cold arrived like an executioner. November temperatures plummeted below freezing and kept dropping. December saw temperatures hit minus 30 degrees Celsius, that's minus 22 Fahrenheit. Fuel ran out almost immediately. Coal supplies were exhausted by October. Firewood became more valuable than money. People tore apart wooden buildings, ripped up floorboards, burned furniture, books, anything combustible. Water pipes froze solid. Electricity became sporadic, then stopped entirely in most districts. The city went dark. Historian Anna Reid, in her book Leningrad, The Epic Siege of World War II, interviewed dozens of survivors. One woman, Yelena Skryabina, kept a diary throughout the siege. Her entry from December 1941 reads, "We have eaten the cat. We have eaten the wallpaper paste. My husband brought home a jar of linseed oil meant for machinery. We drank it mixed with hot water. I can feel my body consuming itself." People were burning between 1,500 and 2,000 calories per day just to stay warm and maintain basic bodily functions. The bread ration provided maybe 500 calories. Starvation progressed in stages. First, the body consumed fat reserves, then muscle tissue, Then, in the final stages, the body began breaking down organs. People's faces became skeletal, eyes sunk into their heads, limbs withered. Walking became difficult, then impossible. The medical term is dystrophy, essentially the body eating itself. The death toll in December 1941 was approximately 53,000 people. In January 1942, it jumped to 100,000. In February, another 100,000. These are official Soviet figures, and most historians believe they're underestimated. Bodies accumulated in apartments because families lacked the strength to carry them downstairs. Bodies lined the streets, frozen solid in the positions they died in. Collection teams with sleds would patrol neighborhoods, stacking corpses like cordwood. The psychological toll was devastating. Survivor accounts describe a city of living ghosts. People moved slowly, mechanically, focused entirely on obtaining the next ration card, the next piece of bread. Conversation ceased, social bonds frayed. Dmitry Likhachev, a cultural historian trapped in the siege, later wrote, "Hunger destroys not just the body, but the soul. People stopped being people. We became creatures of instinct." And then there was cannibalism. Soviet authorities tried to suppress reports, but NKVD records declassified decades later tell the story. By winter 1942, cases of cannibalism were being documented weekly. Most involved consumption of already dead bodies, but there were cases, rare but real, of murder for meat. The NKVD created special units to investigate. According to their reports, over 2,000 people were arrested for cannibalism during the siege. Most were executed. The actual number of cases was almost certainly higher. Parents faced impossible choices. Do you give your children your ration and starve faster? Do you take their ration to maintain your strength so you can perhaps forage for food? Families disintegrated. There are accounts of mothers shielding their children's corpses from neighbors to preserve ration cards. Others abandoned their children at orphanages because they couldn't feed them. The orphanages themselves became death houses, with mortality rates exceeding 50%. Yet life continued in surreal ways. The Leningrad Radio Orchestra, skeletal and weak, performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in August 1942. The performance was broadcast across the city. Musicians fainted from hunger during rehearsals. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, had to prop up performers who couldn't stand, but they played. The symphony became a symbol of resistance, a middle finger to the Germans who were trying to exterminate them. Schools remained open, though attendance was sporadic. Teachers, themselves starving, continued lessons. One teacher, Alexander Fadyeev, recorded in his diary, "Today 3 students are absent. 2 have died. 1 is too weak to walk. I taught grammar to 5 children who can barely hold a pencil. Why? Because if we stop teaching, we admit they've won." Lake Ladoga was the only way in or out of Leningrad. 30 miles of water in summer, 30 miles of ice in winter. The Soviets called it the Road of Life. Others called it the Road of Death. Both names were accurate. Before the lake froze, Soviet commanders organized a supply flotilla. Barges and small ships ferried food, ammunition, and fuel across the lake under constant threat of German air attack. Luftwaffe bombers hunted the convoys. Hundreds of tons of supplies ended up at the bottom of Lake Ladoga, but enough got through to keep the city from total collapse. In November, as temperatures dropped, the ice began forming. Soviet engineers monitored it obsessively. Ice needed to be at least 7 inches thick to support horse-drawn sleds, 12 inches for trucks, 20 inches for heavy loads. The ice was uneven, treacherous, constantly shifting, too thin in spots, pressure ridges and others, and the Germans knew about it. Artillery zeroed in on the ice road. Aircraft bombed it daily. The first convoys ventured onto the ice in late November 1941. Horse-drawn sleds carried sacks of flour, moving in slow processions across the frozen lake. Drivers navigated by flags and markers, often in total darkness to avoid German aircraft. If the ice cracked, sled, horses, and driver plunged into water that would kill in minutes. Hundreds of drivers died this way. Their bodies remained entombed in the ice until spring. By January 1942, the ice was thick enough for trucks. Soviet logistics teams organized continuous convoys. Trucks loaded with food drove into Leningrad. Trucks loaded with evacuees and factory equipment drove out. The operation was massive and brutal. Drivers worked 20-hour shifts. Frostbite was common. German artillery and aircraft inflicted constant casualties, but the convoys kept moving. Official records show that between November 1941 and April 1942, when the ice melted, the Ladoga Ice Road delivered over 360,000 tons of supplies into Leningrad. That sounds like a lot, but spread across 5 months and 3 million people, it's barely enough to keep starvation at bay. The bread ration increased slightly in February 1942, but only to 500 grams for workers and 300 grams for dependents. Still starvation, just slower. The ice road also evacuated over 550,000 people during the winter of 1941 to 1942, mostly children, elderly, and the seriously ill. But even evacuation was dangerous. Convoys were bombed. Trucks broke through ice. Some evacuees died en route from starvation or exposure. And leaving meant abandoning home, possessions, everything. Many refused to go, believing the siege would end soon. For many of them, it was a fatal mistake. When the ice melted in April 1942, Lake Ladoga became a lake again. The Soviets shifted back to barge convoys, but now they could move larger volumes. Food supplies increased gradually. The death rate began to drop. In March, 90,000 people died. In April, 60,000. By May, it was down to 50,000. Still horrific, but the worst seemed to be over. The city began to recover slowly. People emerged from their apartments, blinking in the sunlight. Crews cleared streets of rubble and corpses. Parks were converted to vegetable gardens. Every scrap of open ground was turned over and planted. Cabbages, potatoes, beets, anything that would grow in the short northern summer. Leningrad became a city of gardeners. Survivor accounts describe people tending tiny plots with fanatical devotion. A handful of potatoes could mean the difference between life and death. The Soviet military fortified the defensive lines, trenches, bunkers, minefields, anti-tank obstacles. The Germans launched probing attacks throughout 1942, but they never came close to breaking through. Hitler remained committed to starving the city rather than taking it by force. The bombardment continued. Artillery shells and bombs were a daily fact of life. Air raid sirens became background noise. Cultural life resumed in fragile, tentative ways. Theaters reopened with skeleton crews performing for audiences of starving spectators. The Hermitage Museum, its treasures evacuated east, hosted lectures and exhibitions in freezing halls. People attended because it was a way to feel human again, to remember there was more to life than ration cards and survival. But survival remained precarious. The ration was still barely adequate. Malnutrition was universal. Diseases, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis ravaged the weakened population. Medical supplies were scarce. Hospitals operated without heat or electricity. Surgeons performed amputations by candlelight. Death remained a constant companion, just less immediate than the previous winter. The second winter brought fresh terror. People who had survived the first winter were weaker, their bodies depleted. The bread ration remained tight, never enough to fully recover strength. The cold returned in November, and with it, the fear that the dying would begin again. But this winter was different. The Soviets were better prepared. Food stockpiles were larger. The Ladoga supply route was more efficient. The ration held steady, and in some cases increased slightly. Meat appeared sporadically. Vegetables from the summer gardens supplemented diets. The death toll remained high, thousands per month, but it wasn't the mass die-off of the previous winter. The military situation also shifted. The Red Army had stopped the Germans at Stalingrad in late 1942. The tide of the war was turning. Soviet forces around Leningrad launched offensives to try to break the siege, but German defenses held firm. The encirclement remained intact. The city was still cut off, still under bombardment, still suffering. But there was a sense, faint but real, that survival was possible, that the siege might actually end. On January 12, 1943, the Red Army launched Operation Iskra, Spark. Two fronts, the Leningrad Front and the Volkhov Front, attacked simultaneously from opposite sides of the German corridor south of Lake Ladoga. The goal was to punch a hole through the German lines and establish a land corridor into Leningrad. The fighting was savage. Soviet troops attacked across frozen rivers and through dense forests in sub-zero temperatures. German forces fought back with everything they had. Artillery duels shook the ground. Tanks clashed in close-range engagements. Casualties on both sides were staggering. But the Soviets had numbers and momentum. They ground forward, meter by bloody meter. On January 18, 1943, units from the Leningrad Front and the Volkhov Front linked up near the town of Schliesselburg. The corridor was narrow, just 6 to 7 miles wide, but it was open. For the first time in 16 months, Leningrad had a land connection to the rest of the Soviet Union. The Soviets immediately began construction of a railway line through the corridor. Engineers worked under constant German artillery fire. The line, called the Corridor of Death because of the casualties during its construction, was operational by February. Trains began rolling into Leningrad carrying food, ammunition, and fuel. The bread ration increased, not to abundance, nowhere close, but to something approaching adequacy. The breakthrough didn't end the siege. The corridor was too narrow and too exposed. German artillery could shell the railway almost at will. Trains ran at night to avoid aircraft. Casualties among railway workers were heavy. And the city remained surrounded on 3 sides, still under bombardment, still isolated. But there was a sense, faint but real, that survival was possible, that the siege might actually end. Throughout 1943, Leningrad remained under siege, but conditions improved incrementally. The narrow corridor allowed more supplies to reach the city. Rations stabilized and even increased slightly. The population, still malnourished and exhausted, began to regain strength. Factories resumed production. The Kidov plant, one of the city's major industrial facilities, started turning out tanks again. Workers, many of them women and teenagers, labored in freezing conditions to produce T-34s that would roll straight from the factory floor to the front lines. The German bombardment continued throughout the year. Artillery shells and bombs still fell daily. According to Soviet records, over 107,000 aerial bombs and 150,000 artillery shells hit Leningrad during the entire siege. Civilians learned to live with the constant threat. Shelters were dug into basements and parks. Air raid drills became routine. Death from bombardment was random and arbitrary. A shell could land on your building or the one next door. All you could do was keep moving and hope. By late 1943, the Soviet military was preparing for a major offensive. The Red Army had grown enormously in strength. New divisions, equipped with American and British Lend-Lease supplies, were massing around Leningrad. The Germans, meanwhile, were stretched thin. The Eastern Front was collapsing in the south. Hitler's attention had shifted away from Leningrad. Army Group North was ordered to hold its positions, but reinforcements and supplies were being diverted elsewhere. On January 14, 1944, the Red Army launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. Over 800,000 Soviet troops attacked the German lines from multiple directions. The goal was not just to break the siege, but to smash Army Group North entirely and drive the Germans back into the Baltic states. The offensive was overwhelming. Soviet artillery, thousands of guns, pounded German positions for hours. Infantry and tanks surged forward. The Germans fought back, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Within days, Soviet forces had broken through the German defenses south of Leningrad. The encirclement was collapsing. On January 27, 1944, exactly 872 days after it began, the Siege of Leningrad was officially lifted. Soviet troops drove the Germans back beyond artillery range of the city. That evening, Leningrad celebrated with a fireworks display, the first in nearly 3 years. Survivors, many of them still skeletal and weak, gathered in the streets. Some cried, others stood in silence, unable to process that it was finally over. The Siege of Leningrad lasted 872 days. The death toll is staggering and remains subject to historical debate. Soviet official records claim approximately 632,000 civilians died, mostly from starvation. Most historians believe this is a significant underestimate. Independent studies, including work by Russian and Western researchers, suggest the true civilian death toll was between 800,000 and 1.5 million. Some estimates go higher. The vast majority, over 90%, died from starvation and related diseases, not from German bombardment. The siege was a deliberate policy of extermination. Hitler's directive was clear: let them starve. The Germans succeeded in killing more people through starvation than they could have through direct combat. It was genocide by siege. The survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Medical studies conducted after the war found that siege survivors suffered from chronic health problems, including heart disease, digestive disorders, and psychological trauma. Children who lived through the siege showed developmental delays and lifelong health complications. The psychological scars were just as deep. Survivors described nightmares, anxiety, and an inability to ever feel truly safe. The city itself was devastated. Large sections were in ruins. Thousands of buildings were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Infrastructure, water, power, transportation had to be rebuilt from scratch. But Leningrad recovered. The city was awarded the title Hero City by the Soviet government. Monuments were erected. The siege became a central part of Soviet and Russian national identity, a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and ultimate victory. In 1991, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the city's name was changed back to St. Petersburg, reclaiming its pre-revolutionary identity. But the memory of the siege remains. The Piskaryovskoye Memorial Cemetery, where nearly 500,000 siege victims are buried in mass graves, is one of the most visited sites in the city. A sign at the entrance reads, "Let no one forget. Let nothing be forgotten." The Siege of Leningrad stands as one of the most horrific events in human history. It was a city of 3 million people, cut off, starved, frozen, and bombarded for nearly 900 days, and yet the city did not surrender. The people endured unimaginable suffering, and they survived. There are stories from the siege that defy comprehension. Soldiers who held defensive positions while starving to death, doctors who performed surgeries without anesthesia, teachers who taught classes to children who would be dead within weeks, parents who gave their rations to their children, knowing it meant their own deaths. These weren't heroes in the Hollywood sense. They were ordinary people pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. The Germans failed to take Leningrad, but they succeeded in creating a humanitarian catastrophe of monstrous proportions. The siege was not a military necessity. It was an ideological decision. Hitler wanted the city and its population erased. The German High Command knew that starvation would kill civilians in the hundreds of thousands, and they proceeded anyway. It was a war crime on a scale that still shocks historians today. But the siege also reveals something profound about human resilience. Against all logic, against every instinct for self-preservation, people found ways to survive. They formed communities. They shared scraps of food. They maintained schools, hospitals, and theaters in conditions that should have reduced the city to chaos. The Siege of Leningrad is a story of horror, but it's also a story of endurance. 872 days, over 1 million dead, and at the end, the city stood. Leningrad didn't fall because its people refused to let it fall. They endured cold, hunger, bombardment, and death on a scale almost beyond comprehension. And when it was over, they rebuilt. If you found this story as gripping as I did, hit the subscribe button. There are dozens more stories like this, moments in history where ordinary people faced extraordinary circumstances. Drop a comment and let me know, what other sieges or military events should I cover next? Thanks for watching. Don't forget what happened here.